On the evening of 26 in March 1883, at 665th Avenue in New York City, the new Vanderbilt Chateau glows like a great lantern above the cobblestone street, its limestone facade catching the last purple light of a late winter afternoon, while gas jets flicker to life in every tall window. Inside, the air carries the mingled scents of beeswax candles, the particular warmth of gaslight, and the hundreds of cut roses, orchids, and lilies that have been arriving by the cartload since before dawn, transforming the already elaborate rooms into something approaching a botanical fantasy. The occasion is a costume ball, the most elaborate private entertainment in American history, newspapers will later declare, and the stakes are nothing less than the social legitimacy of an entire family. In a photograph taken that season by the society portraitist Jose Maria Mora, Alva Erskine Vanderbilt stands rigid and immaculate in the immense French Renaissance hall that her money and vision have created. She is a small figure dwarfed by carved stone chimney pieces and coffered ceilings that soar overhead, her elaborate gown heavy with embroidery and the weight of expectations that extend far beyond this single evening. The costume she has chosen, a Venetian princess from the Renaissance, announces both her cultural aspirations and her understanding of spectacle as a form of power. Before the first guest arrives for what will become the defining social event of the Gilded Age, she steps to a long console table where footmen have arranged crystal vases in precise formation. With deliberate fingers, she adjusts a spray of white lilies, turning one bloom just slightly so that it faces the doorway where Mrs. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the self-appointed arbiter of New York society, will soon be forced to enter. It is a feminine ritual that appears to be mere decoration, but functions as calculated strategy. Flowers arranged as a line of battle against the woman who has spent years refusing to acknowledge the Vanderbilt name. For more than a decade, Mrs. Astor has declined to call at Vanderbilt houses, has failed to leave her card, has treated the family's immense railroad fortune as too new, too raw, too obviously commercial to merit social recognition. Tonight, that exclusion ends, not because Mrs. Astor has changed her mind, but because Alva has engineered circumstances that leave the older woman no choice. Society columns will gush tomorrow over the gorgeous display, the $250,000 spectacle that has finally compelled the keeper of the 400 to bow and submit. In the golden glow of 1,000 chandeliers, surrounded by guests in costumes that rival theatrical productions, it will seem like an absolute triumph. The arrival of new money at the table where old money has so long held an exclusive court. But every petal in these elaborate arrangements has been purchased at a cost that someone, perhaps a daughter not yet old enough to understand the bargains being made on her behalf, will eventually be required to pay. The flowers Alva adjusts with such precise attention are exquisite, their perfume filling the hall with sweetness that masks the calculations beneath. They are also a warning of what is to come, a life in which beauty will always serve strategy, in which elegance will always be a weapon, in which the arrangements of drawing rooms and ballrooms will determine the arrangements of marriages and fortunes. On 17th of January, 1853, in a commodious house at 201 Government Street in Mobile, Alabama, Alva Erskine Smith entered a world shaped by cotton, commerce, and the peculiar hierarchies of the antebellum South. Her father, Murray Forbes Smith, had built his fortune as a cotton merchant, his business dealings connecting him to the plantations that stretched across Alabama and Mississippi, his ledgers recording transactions that depended, directly or indirectly, on the labor of enslaved people, a fact that later historians would underline more clearly than her own generation ever acknowledged. Her mother, Phoebe Desha, brought to the marriage a lineage of some political distinction. Her grandfather had served in the United States Congress, and the Desha name carried weight in Kentucky political circles that translated into social standing even in Mobile's drawing rooms. The house on Government Street reflected the comfortable prosperity of a successful merchant family in the Deep South's most important port city. High ceilings helped dissipate the subtropical heat that made summers in Mobile nearly unbearable for those accustomed to northern climates. French doors opened onto gardens where magnolias and camellias bloomed in profusion. Servants, some enslaved, some free, moved through the rooms according to rhythms established by the peculiar institution that structured every aspect of Southern life. The young Alva absorbed these arrangements as natural, inevitable, simply the way the world was ordered. The understanding that wealth derived from complex systems of labor and exploitation, the appreciation for architecture and proportion that warm climates and French colonial influence encouraged, the awareness that a family's position required constant maintenance and display. All these lessons began in Mobile, in a house that would later seem impossibly remote from the limestone chateau she would build on Fifth Avenue. By 1859, as sectional tensions between North and South intensified and the prospect of civil war became increasingly real, Murray Smith made the decision that would reshape his family's trajectory. He relocated them northward, away from the cotton economy whose future seemed increasingly uncertain. The Smiths took up residence near Madison Square in Manhattan, joining the community of transplanted Southerners who maintained their connections to the cotton trade while positioning themselves in the commercial capital of the nation. But New York proved only a way station. Within a few years, the family crossed the Atlantic entirely, settling in Neuilly-sur-Seine, just outside Paris, where a private boarding school would provide Alva and her sisters with the kind of education that ambitious American families increasingly sought for their daughters. The curriculum at this French establishment, its exact name lost to history, though its location and character are documented in later biographical accounts, emphasized subjects that American schools of the era often neglected or treated superficially. Languages, certainly. French became not merely a subject of study, but the medium of daily life, the language in which young Alva learned to think and argue and charm. History was taught as the sweep of civilizations, from ancient Greece and Rome through the Renaissance and into the modern era, providing a framework for understanding how power accumulated and expressed itself across centuries. Art and architecture received serious attention, treated not merely as accomplishments for young ladies, but as subjects worthy of intellectual engagement. Architecture became a particular fascination for the young Alva. She would later recall walking the streets of Paris with sketchbooks, studying the proportions of buildings, learning to read in stone and marble the intentions of designers long dead. The vocabulary of cornices and pilasters, of entablatures and rustication, of formal gardens and classical proportion, all this became part of her intellectual equipment years before she would have occasion to apply it. While other American girls of her class learned to play piano and paint watercolors, Alva was absorbing the language of monumental building, storing knowledge that would prove consequential when she had the resources to build monuments of her own. Summers brought the family back across the Atlantic to Newport, Rhode Island, where a different kind of education awaited. The wooden cottages that lined Bellevue Avenue in the 1860s were modest compared to the marble palaces that would later dominate the landscape. Comfortable summer homes for wealthy families escaping the heat of New York and Boston, not yet the competitive architectural statements they would become. But the social rituals that govern Newport life were already well established, and on verandas smelling of salt air and hydrangea blossoms, young Alva watched and learned. Older women orchestrated the intricate choreography of summer society, the morning calls that followed precise protocols, the seating arrangements at dinner that announced hierarchies as clearly as any proclamation, the floral centerpieces whose arrangements signaled taste and resources. From childhood, her world taught two lessons simultaneously. Beauty was never accidental, but always constructed, and power concealed itself most effectively in arrangements that appeared merely decorative. One day, she would arrange not merely flowers, but an entire coastline. By the early 1870s, when Alva had reached young womanhood and the family had returned permanently to New York City, the fortunes that had once made the Smiths comfortable were alarmingly unstable. The Civil War had devastated the cotton trade that had sustained Murray Smith's business. Reconstruction had transformed the Southern economy in ways that disadvantaged merchants who had depended on the old systems and their old connections. The family maintained appearances. They still occupied respectable addresses in Manhattan, still moved in circles where their Southern connections and European education counted for something. But the financial foundation was eroding beneath them, and everyone in the household understood the precariousness of their position. Biographers note that in these straitened circumstances, the four surviving Smith daughters were expected to marry well as a family survival strategy. This was neither unusual nor shameful in the context of the era. Countless American families of declining fortune looked to their daughters as bridges to renewed prosperity, understanding that a strategic marriage could rescue an entire clan from genteel poverty. What distinguished Alva from many young women in similar circumstances was the clarity with which she understood and eventually embraced this calculus. She would later acknowledge, with a frankness unusual for her generation, that she had married not primarily for love, but to save her family from the bankruptcy that otherwise seemed inevitable. The opportunity that would transform everything presented itself at a party hosted for one of William Henry Vanderbilt's daughters, an entertainment where the vast Vanderbilt fortune created a setting of luxury that would have been unimaginable to most Americans. The Vanderbilts had become, in the decades since the Commodore's death, perhaps the wealthiest family in the nation, their railroad and shipping interests generating income that dwarfed the fortunes of older, more established families. They had money beyond calculation, but they lacked the social acceptance that older New York families took for granted. They remained, in the eyes of Mrs. Astor and her circle, new people whose commercial origins disqualified them from the best society regardless of how many millions they accumulated. At this party, Alva's childhood friend Consuelo Iznaga, herself the daughter of a Cuban planter family navigating the treacherous waters of New York society, made an introduction that would reshape multiple lives. William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the legendary Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, was young, reasonably handsome, heir to a share of the largest fortune in America, and notably lacking in the social polish that his wealth might have been expected to purchase. He needed what Alva could provide: education, taste, cultural sophistication, the ability to translate money into the forms of display that commanded respect. She needed what he represented: financial security, not just for herself, but for her entire struggling family. The scene of their meeting played out like countless other Gilded Age gatherings, gaslight softening the contours of a crowded ballroom, music from an orchestra tucked into an alcove, the rustle of silk and satin as young people moved through the figures of a quadrille. But beneath the conventional surface, calculations were being made on both sides. Letters and later interviews suggest that Alva approached the developing courtship with clear-eyed pragmatism, understanding exactly what she sought and what she offered in return. Whether genuine affection also developed, whether the marriage would prove to be more than merely transactional, the historical record does not clearly reveal. What is documented is that within a few years of that first meeting, the negotiations had concluded successfully. On 20th April 1875, at Calvary Church in New York City, Alva Erskine Smith became Mrs. William Kissam Vanderbilt in a ceremony that society columns covered with extensive detail. They noted the French lace of her gown, the crush of carriages outside the church, the flowers that decorated the altar and filled the reception rooms afterward, all the external signs of a wedding between prominent families. They understood, as their readers understood, that this was more than a personal union. It was the merger of a struggling Southern family with one of the richest clans in America, a transaction that promised benefits to both parties in ways that need not be spoken aloud. Behind the floral altar displays and beneath the music of the organ lay a quieter ledger of exchange and expectation. The Smiths gained financial security and access to resources beyond anything they could have achieved independently. The Vanderbilts gained something harder to quantify but equally valuable: a daughter-in-law who understood how to translate money into social position, who had studied the architecture of European civilization and could apply those lessons to the urgent project of Vanderbilt legitimacy. The girl who had once arranged flowers in other people's parlors, who had learned by watching how such arrangements could signal taste and command respect, was about to design her own stage. She would spare no expense in its construction. Between 1878 and 1882, on a lot at 6060 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan that had previously held more modest structures, Alva Vanderbilt oversaw the creation of something New York had never seen. A private residence built in the style of a French Renaissance chateau, its limestone facade and elaborate ornamentation, announcing that a new kind of wealth had arrived on the avenue and intended to stay. Working closely with architect Richard Morris Hunt, the first American to study at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the designer who had come to define Gilded Age architecture, she translated her European education into 3 dimensions of vin, carved stone, stained glass, and gilded plaster. Later accounts describe her involvement in the construction process with vivid, sometimes exaggerated detail. She was said to be knee-deep in mortar, arguing with craftsmen over the precise curve of a cornice, debating with Hunt himself about the proportions of a staircase, demanding changes to plans that she felt did not meet her standards. Whether literally accurate or not, these stories captured something true about her approach. She was not a passive client awaiting results, but an active collaborator who had absorbed enough architectural vocabulary during her Paris education to speak Hunt's language and challenge his judgments. The house that emerged from this intense collaboration, later known as the Petit Chateau, became both a home for her growing family and a manifesto announcing Vanderbilt's intentions to the world. But for all the splendor of 660 Fifth Avenue, the Vanderbilts remained socially excluded from the circles that mattered most in New York's stratified society. Mrs. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the self-appointed arbiter of acceptable company, maintained rigid control over who counted as respectable. Her famous 400, supposedly the number of guests who could fit comfortably in her ballroom, though the phrase had come to represent the entire system of social exclusion she enforced, did not include the Vanderbilts. They were too new, their fortune too recently acquired, their wealth too obviously derived from commerce rather than the land and mercantile traditions that gave older families their claim to aristocratic status. Mrs. Astor's weapon was simple but devastatingly effective. She did not call, in the elaborate protocol of Gilded Age society, a formal call, a visit to leave one's card and be received, or at least acknowledged by the hostess, was the essential first step in establishing social relations between families. Without Mrs. Astor's call, the Vanderbilts could not formally invite her daughter Carrie to their entertainments. Without that invitation, the daughter could not attend. And without such attendance, the Vanderbilts remained outside the magic circle regardless of how much money they spent on limestone and French furniture. The system was designed precisely to exclude people like the Vanderbilts, people whose money was too new and too obviously commercial to merit acceptance, and it functioned exactly as intended. Alva's response to this exclusion was characteristically audacious. If Mrs. Astor would not come to her willingly, she would engineer circumstances that left the older woman no choice. She planned a costume ball for the evening of 22nd March 1883 that would be so spectacular, so lavish, so utterly unprecedented in the history of American private entertainment that refusal to attend would become socially impossible. The preparations consumed months of effort and reportedly cost at least $250,000, a sum that would equal many millions in later currency. Florists stripped greenhouses across the eastern seaboard to supply the flowers. Decorators transformed already elaborate rooms into fantastical tableaux. Customers created outfits that rivaled professional theatrical productions. The social mechanism Alva deployed was precise and carefully calculated. Mrs. Astor's daughter, Carrie, had been rehearsing for weeks with a group of friends for a special quadrille, a formal dance that would be one of the evening's featured entertainments. But without an invitation to the ball, Carrie could not participate in the quadrille she had practiced so diligently. And without Mrs. Astor's formal call at the Vanderbilt house, protocol prevented Alva from issuing that invitation. The pressure mounted as the date of the ball approached. Society buzzed with anticipation. Carrie Astor faced the humiliation of being excluded from the event that everyone she knew would attend and discuss for years afterward. Finally, inevitably, Mrs. Astor surrendered. Her footmen arrived at 660 Fifth Avenue bearing her card, the formal acknowledgement that the Vanderbilts existed as social beings, that they might be visited, that they had achieved the recognition that money alone had been unable to purchase. The ball proceeded in triumph. Society columns and newspapers marveled at the orchids and roses and lilies massed under the novel brilliance of electric lights. Guests appeared in costumes that became legendary. Alva's sister-in-law, Alice Vanderbilt, wore the famous electric light dress, its fabric wired with actual incandescent bulbs that glittered and sparkled as she moved through the magnificent rooms. Alva herself moved through her chateau, adjusting arrangements and guests alike, orchestrating the spectacle she had conceived and executed. "The time has come for the Vanderbilts," Mrs. Astor reportedly conceded, but winning a place at the table would demand ever grander stages and would eventually expose the fractures that already existed, invisibly, within the Vanderbilt marriage and family. In the mid-1860s, years before her marriage transformed her circumstances, the adolescent Alva had absorbed lessons at her Paris boarding school that would prove more consequential than anyone, perhaps including herself, could have anticipated. The curriculum at the establishment in Neuilly-sur-Seine was designed to produce cultivated young women capable of gracing the drawing rooms of European and American society. But for Alva, it became something more profound. A training ground for an eye that could read stone and space with the same facility that other women learned to read fashion plates and social registers. The classroom smelled of chalk dust and the particular mustiness of old European buildings. Outside the tall windows, plane trees filtered the gray Parisian light that would later seem so different from the bright American sun. In letters quoted by later historians, Alva expressed fascination with French buildings and their proportions, absorbing the technical vocabulary of architectural form long before Richard Morris Hunt would sketch designs for her approval. Cornices and pilasters, entablatures and rustication, the classical orders and their proper application. All this knowledge accumulated in a mind that was learning to think of space itself as a medium that could be shaped to communicate power and intention. This was ostensibly a finishing school, preparing young women of good families for their roles as wives and hostesses. But for Alva, the curriculum extended far beyond the conventional accomplishments. Yes, she learned to curtsy properly, to manage a household staff, to write correspondence in the approved forms, but she also learned to analyze how buildings communicated status and intention, to understand why certain proportions pleased the eye while others created unease, to recognize the historical precedents that informed contemporary design. She was learning, though she could not yet know how she would apply this knowledge, the vocabulary that would eventually allow her to commission monuments that would reshape the American landscape. The formal curriculum was supplemented by less structured education in the streets and gardens of Paris itself. On free afternoons, she and her schoolmates walked through the great public spaces that Haussmann's reconstruction had created, the wide boulevards, the formal squares, the gardens whose carefully designed perspectives created effects of grandeur and order. She observed how flower beds and pathways structured space, directing the viewer's gaze toward particular focal points, controlling movement and attention through the seemingly natural arrangement of plants and paths. These were lessons in spatial organization that would manifest years later in her insistence on formal parterres and precisely arranged terraces at her Newport estate, understanding that a garden was not merely a collection of plants but a system for controlling experience. While many American heiresses of her generation practiced deportment and piano, the conventional accomplishments expected of young ladies, Alva was quietly practicing something quite different. She was developing an eye that could read the built environment as others read novels or music scores, understanding how spaces communicated meaning and enforced hierarchies. When she returned to America, she would apply this training not merely to her wardrobe or her table settings, as convention expected, but to the skyline of Fifth Avenue and the landscape of Newport's Bellevue Avenue. The architecture of ambition that would define her life was already taking shape in the classrooms and streets of Paris. By the early 1880s, the house at 6060 Fifth Avenue had become both Alva's home and her laboratory for the experiments in social engineering that would define her career as a hostess and power broker. The Petit Chateau, as the house came to be known, was more than merely a residence. It was a stage on which the transformation of the Vanderbilt family from new money outsiders to acknowledged members of society's inner circle would be performed and perfected. Working with Richard Morris Hunt and a small army of decorators and craftsmen, Alva shaped interiors modeled on French Renaissance precedents. Galleries lined with old master paintings purchased en bloc from European collections, carved staircases that rose through light wells designed to dramatize every arrival and departure. Salons engineered for maximum theatrical impact when servants threw open connecting doors to reveal a progression of increasingly magnificent rooms. The household staff numbered in the dozens, each member trained to precise standards that Alva personally supervised and enforced. Maids dusted gilt picture frames at dawn, long before anyone who mattered could see them working. Florists refreshed the arrangements on mantelpieces and console tables before each meal and each social occasion. Footmen carried calling card trays at angles calculated to present the engraved names for easy reading by mistresses who might receive dozens of such cards in a single afternoon. Every detail contributed to an effect of seamless, almost supernatural perfection, the illusion that beauty and order arose spontaneously rather than being produced by intensive labor and relentless supervision. The rustle of silk skirts on polished parquet floors, the scent of fresh flowers replaced daily regardless of season or expense, the gleam of silver and crystal maintained to standards that would satisfy the most demanding inspection. All these became as much part of the Vanderbilt brand as the railroads and steamships that generated the fortune. Guests who entered 660 Fifth Avenue were meant to understand immediately that they had entered a realm of refinement that matched or exceeded anything the old families could offer. The house itself was an argument, expressed in stone and gilt and velvet, that Vanderbilt money deserved Vanderbilt respect. The education in taste and social strategy that Alva had begun in Paris continued through her involvement with New York's emerging cultural institutions. When the established Academy of Music, whose boxes were controlled by old money families who guarded their exclusivity jealously, declined to provide adequate accommodation for new money families like the Vanderbilts, Alva helped organize the response that would transform the city's cultural landscape, the founding of a new metropolitan opera house in which Vanderbilt money played a significant role, demonstrated that wealth could create alternatives when existing institutions proved inhospitable. An opera box, she understood, was not merely a place from which to hear music, but a stage from which to be seen, a platform for displaying jewels and gowns and the measured gestures of refinement that announced one's fitness for the best society. Every appearance in the Vanderbilt box at the Metropolitan Opera became a performance within the larger performance. Every bow exchanged across the house a signal in the complex semaphore of social positioning. Every carefully arranged bouquet of violets or orchids received from an admirer a marker of status and influence. The chateau on Fifth Avenue was teaching lessons to everyone who entered it, including Alva's daughter Consuelo, born in 1877, who learned from earliest childhood that in her mother's world, refinement was not gentle but engineered, not spontaneous but relentlessly calculated. Marble House, still years in the future, would be the graduate course in this education. The Petit Chateau was merely the rigorous introduction. By the mid-1880s, Alva and William K. Vanderbilt had established themselves as regular summer residents of Newport, Rhode Island, occupying a wooden cottage on Bellevue Avenue that already felt insufficient compared to the stone palaces beginning to rise around them. The transformation of Newport from a modest summer colony frequented by literary figures and old money families into the most exclusive and most competitive resort in America was accelerating rapidly, driven by the same dynamics of display and one-upmanship that had reshaped Fifth Avenue. Families with fortunes measured in tens of millions of dollars were building cottages, whose scale and elaboration would have been considered palatial by any reasonable standard. Mansions designed not merely for comfort, but for the projection of power and status. Biographical essays describe Alva walking the grounds of her summer property during these years, pacing the lawn that stretched between the wooden house and the sea, studying the sight lines and imagining something more permanent, more monumental, more capable of expressing the position she had achieved and the ambitions that remained unrealized. The view toward the Atlantic was spectacular, the ocean stretching to the horizon, sunlight sparkling on the waves, salt air carrying the scent of beach roses and seaweed, but the structure at her back seemed increasingly inadequate as a statement of Vanderbilt supremacy. On humid summer afternoons, while gardeners trimmed the hedges and staked the roses that bordered the lawn in proper order, Alva experimented with the arrangements that would govern Newport's social calendar. She moved chairs and tables herself, testing sight lines, discovering through trial and observation how the placement of furniture could direct the flow of conversation and the focus of attention. That strip of grass between house and ocean, later described by architectural historians as a classic stage for social performance, represented a space where she could position herself as the equal of Mrs. Astor or any other rival matriarch, if only she possessed the proper architectural backdrop against which to stand. She observed how guests at her teas and lawn parties naturally clustered beneath the striped awnings that provided shelter from the summer sun, how a vase of white flowers placed on an outdoor table could draw the eye across an entire terrace, how the arrangement of seating could include some guests in the most desirable conversations while subtly excluding others. These observations accumulated into practical knowledge, experience becoming data, intuition being refined into strategy. The Newport lawn was still bordered by the modest wooden cottage she had outgrown, but Alva was already designing in stone, imagining a structure that would make her position not merely competitive but unassailable. The house she was beginning to envision would not simply rival Mrs. Astor's beechwood across the avenue. It would force everyone who saw it to acknowledge that the era of Vanderbilt supremacy had definitively arrived. Between 1888 and 1892, construction crews transformed the lot at 596 Bellevue Avenue into Marble House, a 50-room summer cottage that would become Alva's most complete statement of architectural ambition and her most enduring monument. The scale of the project staggered contemporaries, approximately 500,000 cubic feet of marble, so much stone that its acquisition and transport constituted a major logistical undertaking, went into a house whose total cost reached an estimated $11 million, $7 million of which was spent on marble alone. These figures, staggering by any standard of the era, announced that Alva intended to build something unprecedented even by Newport's increasingly extravagant standards. Working again with Richard Morris Hunt, now in his 60s and at the height of his creative powers, Alva designed interiors modeled on the grandest French neoclassical precedents. The ballroom glittered with gold leaf applied to every surface of carved wood and molded plaster, its proportions calculated to dwarf guests and elevate the hostess who commanded it. A dining room featured walls of purple marble so rare and so expensive that its installation alone represented a small fortune. The Gothic room was filled with medieval art and artifacts purchased en bloc from the collection of French collector Émile Gauvet, its somber ecclesiastical atmosphere providing studied contrast to the gilded exuberance elsewhere in the house. Alva paid close attention to practical details that would affect how guests experienced the spaces she was creating. She chose warm, cream gold marble for exterior and interior surfaces rather than the cooler white varieties that might have seemed more obviously classical, explaining that she wished to avoid what she called a mausoleum effect, the cold, funereal quality that bright white stone could produce in certain lights. She wanted a glow that would flatter the complexions of her guests, that would make jewels sparkle and silk shimmer more beautifully, that would create an atmosphere of warmth and welcome even within rooms whose scale and formality might otherwise intimidate or overwhelm. Each room was designed as a lesson in how space could direct behavior and enforce hierarchy. Flower arrangements, and Alva planned their placement even before the rooms were completed. Understanding that such details were essential rather than merely decorative led guests' eyes toward the portraits and doorways she wished them to notice, toward the positions where she would stand waiting to receive them, toward the views of ocean and lawn that provided the theatrical backdrop for her social performances. The progression through the house was choreographed as carefully as any dance, with each room revealing itself in calculated sequence to produce maximum impact on visitors whose admiration, or intimidation, was the desired effect. Marble House was presented to the world as a birthday gift that William K. Vanderbilt had given his wife for her 39th year, a gesture of conjugal devotion expressed in millions of dollars of stone and gilt. But it was also, and more significantly, Alva's thesis written in permanent materials, a demonstration that if American society was a fortress controlled by hostile gatekeepers, she would build its most dazzling and impregnable gate. When Consuelo Vanderbilt moved into Marble House as a teenager in the early 1890s, she entered a world of controlled magnificence that left little room for personal expression, youthful spontaneity, or individual preference. The bedroom her mother assigned her, preserved today as part of the House Museum's tour, was austere by Consuelo's own later account. Every piece of furniture chosen by Alva and arranged according to specifications that admitted no deviation. My mother, Consuelo would recall with painful clarity in her memoirs decades afterward, had forbidden the intrusion of my personal possessions into a space that was designed not for a daughter's comfort, but for the completion of an aesthetic scheme whose requirements took precedence over the occupant's desires. The room that visitors to the museum see today still communicates this discipline with undiminished clarity. Controlled colors chosen for their contribution to an overall palette, precise symmetry that permits no casual rearrangement, an arrangement of furniture and objects that seems to forbid any attempt at personalization. It was a place to sleep and dress, certainly, but it was also, perhaps primarily, a place to rehearse submission to a larger plan, to learn that individual preferences mattered less than the overall effect, that one's private self must conform to the demands of public design. Daily life in Marble House followed invisible timetables as rigorously enforced as any school schedule, though far more demanding in their expectations. French lessons took place in high-ceilinged sitting rooms whose proportions seemed designed to make even an adult feel small. A young girl navigating these spaces must have felt dwarfed by architecture that announced, in every surface and proportion, her relative insignificance. Music practice echoed down marble corridors where servants moved silently about their duties, the sound of scales and arpeggios absorbed by stone walls that seemed to judge rather than merely reflect. Posture and deportment were subjects of constant attention and frequent correction. At every meal, every walk through the gardens, every appearance before the guests who filled the house during Newport's summer season, on mornings before the teas and lawn parties that constituted Newport's social calendar, Alva stood in the ballroom directing servants as they arranged massive bowls of roses and lilies, urns so large and heavy they required several strong men to lift and position correctly. Consuelo watched these operations unfold, absorbing lessons that went far beyond the arrangement of flowers. A slight adjustment of a single bloom could change the entire feeling of a room. The positioning of an arrangement could draw attention toward one guest and away from another. Beauty was never merely decorative, but always strategic, always serving purposes that might not be immediately apparent. These were aesthetic decisions, but they were also tactical deployments, a use of beauty in service of social strategy that would become the organizing principle of Consuelo's own life, whether she wished it or not. What Consuelo was learning, though she could not yet fully understand its implications for her own future, was that in her mother's world, love expressed itself through architecture and control, through arrangements that left no space for individual deviation or personal preference. The placement of flowers on a table, the arrangement of furniture in a room, the positioning of guests at dinner, all these seemingly minor decisions were expressions of power, demonstrations of the ability to shape reality according to one's own design. The arrangements of flowers on the ballroom tables foreshadowed the arrangement that Alva was already planning for her daughter's entire future. A future in which personal happiness would be subordinated to strategic advantage, in which love would be less important than alliance, in which a young woman would be positioned like a perfect bloom in a carefully designed composition. By 1892, when Marble House stood complete on Bellevue Avenue, Newport society had absorbed the full shock of what Alva Vanderbilt had created and had begun to reckon with its implications for the hierarchies that had previously governed American social life. Preservation and heritage texts describe the mansion as a social and architectural landmark that set the pace for Newport's transformation, from a comfortable summer colony for old money families into a marble-fronted resort where competitive display replaced genteel understatement as the dominant mode. What Alva had built was not merely a house but a new standard against which all rivals would henceforth be measured. From the lawn stretching between Marble House and the sea, that carefully designed space where she had once experimented with chair placements and flower arrangements while still occupying her modest wooden cottage, Alva could now receive visitors on terms that were entirely her own creation. Scholarship on Newport's social geography notes that from this position she stood as Astor's equal, facing Beechwood, Mrs. Astor's own Newport residence, across an expanse of manicured grass where neither woman needed to approach the other, but both could observe and be observed. The dynamics of their relationship had fundamentally shifted. The hostess who controlled Marble House no longer needed to petition for anyone's recognition. She had constructed a fortress from which recognition could be demanded as tribute rather than begged as favor. Invitations to entertainments at Marble House arrived on heavy cardstock, their engraved text carrying the implicit message that attendance was both a privilege and, increasingly, an expectation. Society pages tracked with obsessive attention who accepted these summons and who pointedly, perhaps courageously, stayed away, reading in every guest list the shifting alignments of power and influence that the new architectural order had created. Inside the house, beneath ceilings, painted with mythological scenes that elevated the domestic to the divine, guests admired flower arrangements in urns so large and so elaborate that they represented logistical achievements as much as aesthetic ones, demonstrations of the resources Alva could command and the taste with which she deployed them. To some observers, this represented the apex of American cultivation, the moment when New World wealth had finally achieved parity with Old World sophistication. Here was proof that American money, properly guided by educated taste, could create beauty to rival anything the European aristocracies had produced across centuries. To other observers, less sympathetic to the Vanderbilt project, Marble House looked like aggression dressed in the language of lilies, beauty deployed as a weapon, refinement serving as a form of social warfare. The transformation of personal rivalry into an arms race measured in square footage and spectacle had reached a point where the original purpose, social acceptance, legitimate standing among the best families, had been almost forgotten in the sheer momentum of competitive display. Alva had achieved what she had once been denied. She was no longer petitioning Mrs. Astor for recognition, but forcing Mrs. Astor and every other rival, including members of her own extended family, to measure their position against her ballroom walls. The question that remained, as the 1890s unfolded, was what new territories awaited conquest, and what the accumulating costs of continued conquest might eventually prove to be. After the triumph of the 1883 costume ball and the big subsequent completion of Marble House, the Vanderbilt clan itself began to fracture along lines of rivalry and resentment that Alva's victories had, perhaps inadvertently, helped to create and intensify. The family that had once seemed united by its common exclusion from the best society now found itself divided by questions of precedence and allocation that Alva's success had made newly urgent. As one New England historical account observes, William Henry Vanderbilt, the patriarch who had inherited and dramatically multiplied the Commodore's original fortune, had been sufficiently impressed by Alva's social achievements that he directed disproportionate shares of family resources toward William K's household. This favoritism, whether intentional or merely perceived, enraged Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the eldest son who might reasonably have expected preference as the senior male of his generation, and particularly enraged his wife, Alice Claypool Vanderbilt. The response to this perceived inequity was, characteristically for this family and this era, architectural. Between 1893 and 1895, even as Alva's own marriage to William K was beginning to show the strains that would eventually destroy it, Cornelius and Alice built the Breakers, also designed by Richard Morris Hunt, who found himself serving as architect to both sides of an intensifying family conflict. The Breakers was deliberately larger than Marble House, more imposing in its scale, its 70 rooms and Italian Renaissance style representing an explicit challenge to Alva's claim of supremacy. The budget for marble alone at the Breakers rivaled what entire city blocks in Manhattan cost to develop. In family photographs and society commentary from these years, the rivalry between Alva and Alice played out in a complex language of gowns, guest lists, and competing entertainments that encoded bitter personal antagonism in the acceptable forms of social hospitality. At dinners hosted by one or the other, the placement of guests became a weapon wielded with precision. Who was seated near the great central flower arrangement, positioned where conversation naturally converged and attention naturally focused, and who was relegated to the far ends of the table, half hidden by greenery and effectively excluded from the most desirable exchanges. The arrangements of flowers and furniture that Alva had studied and mastered were now part of an ongoing family warfare that consumed the energies of both women and their households. The competition that had begun as Alva's bid to humble Mrs. Astor and claim social recognition for the Vanderbilt name had metastasized into something more destructive and more intimate. Sisters-in-law who might once have been allies now faced each other across ballrooms and dining tables like rival generals, their mansions serving as proxies for personal enmity, their entertainments as campaigns in an ongoing war. The more marble the extended family poured into Bellevue Avenue, the more millions they spent on flowers and orchestras and elaborate entertainments designed to outdo each other, the less stable the structures of family unity became. The architecture of Vanderbilt triumph was simultaneously becoming the architecture of Vanderbilt dissolution. In March 1895, Alva Vanderbilt did something that shocked New York society more profoundly than any costume ball or marble palace. She sued her husband William K. Vanderbilt for divorce on grounds of adultery, publicly naming his mistress and making explicit what drawing-room gossip had long whispered. Divorce among the wealthy was not unheard of in the 1890s, but it remained deeply stigmatized, particularly for women, who typically bore the heaviest social consequences regardless of who was actually at fault. For a woman of Alva's prominence to seek divorce publicly, to name specific grounds and specific individuals, to expose the private failures of one of America's richest families to newspaper scrutiny, represented an audacity that matched her architectural ambitions but carried far greater personal risk. Contemporary newspapers covered the divorce proceedings with intense fascination, reporting that the settlement eventually reached over $10 million, one of the largest divorce awards in American history to that point, a sum that represented not merely financial compensation, but a kind of public vindication. Crucially, Alva retained Marble House and other properties outright, maintaining her position as one of Newport's great hostesses, even as her status shifted from Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt to something new and unprecedented. A divorced woman of independent means, substantial resources, and undiminished social ambition. That same tumultuous year, on 6 November 1895 in New York, Alva's daughter Consuelo married Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, in a ceremony that newspapers across America and Europe covered as the apex of the dollar princess phenomenon. Vanderbilt money, specifically a marriage settlement that would help restore the crumbling magnificence of Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, was exchanged for an English ducal title that would place Consuelo among the highest ranks of the British aristocracy. The wedding was photographed and described with the attention usually reserved for royal occasions. its elaborate staging confirming Alva's status as an international power broker capable of arranging alliances across oceans. What the wedding coverage did not reveal, what would only emerge years later during annulment proceedings in 1920 and 1921, was the reality behind the bridal spectacle. Consuelo would testify under oath that she had spent her wedding morning in tears, that she had been in love with another man, that her mother had forced her into the marriage through relentless pressure, emotional manipulation, and threats that made resistance seem impossible. Alva herself, with the remarkable frankness that characterized her later years, would eventually confirm this account, acknowledging publicly what she had done. The Marlborough marriage saved Blenheim Palace from the decay that threatened many great English houses in the era, before death duties and democratic reforms completed their transformation. It confirmed Alva's ability to shape events on an international scale, arranging alliances between American fortunes and European titles as confidently as she had once arranged flowers on a Newport terrace. But it also crystallized, in terms impossible to ignore, the human cost of her strategies. A daughter treated as yet another architectural project, positioned like the perfect bloom in a carefully designed composition, arranged for maximum effect in a ducal great hall with no more consultation than the lilies on a console table. Alva had secured opera boxes, mansions, and a duchess for a daughter, but her most enduring quote would not be about beauty or triumph, it would be a confession. I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. On 11 January 1896, less than a year after her divorce from William K. Vanderbilt was finalized, Alva married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, a banker and horseman whose Newport residence, Belcourt, stood just down Bellevue Avenue from Marble House. The marriage surprised society observers who had assumed that Alva's divorce would effectively end her social career, that she would be shunned, excluded, forced to retreat from the positions she had fought so hard to achieve. Instead, she had simply reorganized her life around a new partner while maintaining the properties and social position that she had built and that she considered rightfully hers. Marble House remained in her possession outright, a fortress she could occupy or abandon as circumstances required, a tangible monument to everything she had accomplished. The Belmont marriage lasted until Oliver's death on 10th of June 1908, and during these dozen years, Alva's public activities focused primarily on the social and architectural projects that had always occupied her attention. She entertained at both Marble House and Belcourt, moved in the circles she had spent decades cultivating, continued to be a figure of fascination for the press and for a public that had watched her rise with a mixture of admiration, envy, and moral disapproval. But Oliver's death opened new directions that would ultimately define her legacy more profoundly than any mansion or costume ball. Within a year of becoming a widow for the second time, Alva had begun the transformation that would occupy her remaining decades. From society hostess to suffrage activist, from builder of ballrooms to advocate for women's political rights. In 1909, she opened the Gilded Ballroom of Marble House, the same magnificent space that had witnessed Newport's most exclusive entertainments, for a women's suffrage conference, welcoming speakers and strategists who were fighting for American women's right to vote. The irony was not lost on observers. The very rooms where social hierarchies had been enforced with such precision were now sheltering women who demanded a fundamental restructuring of American political life. National Park Service and suffrage movement histories document how Alva threw herself into this new cause with the same energy and determination she had once devoted to social conquest. She founded the Political Equality Association in 1909, creating an organization that could channel her resources and connections toward the suffrage cause. She helped finance the Women's Vote Parade in 1912, one of the largest demonstrations for women's rights that Washington had yet witnessed. She eventually became a major funder of the National Woman's Party, the militant organization led by Alice Paul, and served for a time as its president. The transformation was perhaps less incongruous than it initially appeared. Alva had spent decades understanding how power functioned in a world controlled by men, how women's influence operated through indirect channels, through social position and strategic marriages, through the arrangement of drawing rooms and dinner parties rather than through votes and legislation. She understood, from bitter personal experience, how limiting these indirect forms of power could be, how completely a woman's fate could depend on the men around her, regardless of her own abilities or ambitions. The suffrage movement offered a more direct path: political power achieved through the ballot rather than the ballroom, influence exercised openly rather than through manipulation and arrangement. Guests who now crossed the marble threshold of Marble House carried pamphlets and position papers rather than calling cards and dance programs. Flower arrangements still appeared on the console tables and mantels. Alva had not abandoned her appreciation for beauty, but they were fewer and simpler than in the old days, serving as backdrop rather than strategic deployment. The mansion that had once embodied the most rigid hierarchies of Gilded Age society now sheltered women who were demanding an entirely different architecture of power, one in which women would participate as citizens rather than merely as hostesses, as voters rather than as ornaments. On 26 January 1933, Alva Belmont died in Paris at the age of 80, far from the Mobile of her birth and the Newport of her greatest triumphs. She had lived long enough to see the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920, granting American women the voting rights she had fought for in her final decades, a victory she considered more significant than any social conquest. She had witnessed the beginning of the Great Depression, which devastated many of the fortunes that had built Newport's marble palaces and accelerated the decline of the Gilded Age social world she had once dominated and, in her later years, worked to transform. By the later 20th century, the great houses that had lined Fifth Avenue during her era had largely disappeared, demolished to make way for office towers and apartment buildings whose economics demanded different uses of Manhattan's expensive real estate. The Petit Chateau at 1660 Fifth Avenue, scene of the famous 1883 costume ball, was gone. Its French Renaissance facade survived only in photographs and in the architectural influence it had exerted on subsequent buildings. The social world of calling cards and opera boxes, of competitive entertainments and strategic marriages, had faded into historical memory, replaced by new forms of display and competition that Alva would probably have recognized, even if their specific expressions would have seemed foreign. But Marble House survived. In 1963, the Preservation Society of Newport County acquired the mansion and eventually opened it to the public as a museum documenting Gilded Age life. Today, visitors walk through the cool marble entrance hall that Alva designed with such careful attention to proportion and effect, climb the grand staircase whose every curve was calculated to dramatize arrivals, and peer into the rooms that once hosted Newport's most exclusive entertainments. They pause before Consuelo's austere bedroom, where audio guides quote her bitter recollection that her mother had forbidden the intrusion of her personal possessions into the carefully controlled space. They stand in the golden ballroom, now protected by velvet ropes from damage, and try to imagine the events that once animated these silent rooms. On console tables near the long windows that overlook the lawn and ocean, museum staff maintain careful arrangements of fresh flowers, seasonal blooms chosen to echo the colors and sensibilities of the period, positioned to suggest what the house might have looked like when it was occupied, rather than merely preserved. The placement approximates what historical photographs and contemporary descriptions suggest, though no one can say with precision how Alva herself positioned her bouquets on summer mornings before the guests began arriving, where exactly she stood to observe Mrs. Astor's approach across the dividing lawn, how she gestured to servants when a vase required adjustment or a bloom needed turning to better catch the light. The petals that grace Marble House today are quieter than those that once served Alva's purposes, placed for preservation and atmosphere rather than for strategic conquest. The house itself has become what all such monuments eventually become: a document of a vanished world, a record of ambitions and accomplishments and costs that can be studied but never fully recovered. Yet in their poised stillness, under painted ceilings where gods and goddesses still frolic in eternal allegory, you can sense something of the old intention that once animated these spaces. Here was a woman who understood that beauty could serve as an argument in architecture, who knew that the arrangement of a room could determine the arrangement of a life, who built monuments to her own ambition in an era that offered women few legitimate outlets for ambition of any kind, whether what she achieved was triumph or tragedy, liberation, or another form of imprisonment. The historical record does not definitively determine. She forced her way into a world that had been designed to exclude her, built palaces that still stand as testimony to her vision and her will, sacrificed a daughter to a strategy whose cruelty she eventually acknowledged. She lived long enough to fight for the political rights that might have made such strategies unnecessary, to use her mansions as headquarters for causes more consequential than social position. The flowers on the console table catch the afternoon light as visitors file through, their careful arrangement echoing arrangements made more than a century ago by hands that understood how much could be communicated through the positioning of a single bloom. That small gesture, turning a lily to face the doorway, adjusting a rose to better catch the light, contained everything: the ambition, the calculation, the artistry, the cost. The flowers are exquisite still, preserved in their poised perfection. They are also, now as then, something more than mere decoration.